questions, and we'll hand the mic over to you.
My question is that during your career, you must run into discrimination, right? Along probably more than we face today. How do you deal with that? And how you handle the situation? How do you basically?
Okay, the question was, during my career, did I face any discrimination? I have to be honest with you, and I would say that in my military career, if there was any, I didn't notice it or see it. Now, let me tell you about getting back to the business of blending in. In my view, all of us, wherever we work, should try and blend in to the customs and the culture of the company or wherever we're working. Now, in today's environment, we have all this terminology like diversity, multiculturalism, exclusion. In my time period, we didn't have that. So, as far as I could see, I was evaluated based upon performance, just like everybody else, and based upon potential. And there's a difference between performance and potential. Performance means for whatever job you can do great. But leaders like to see, can you do the job of the next higher level or higher? And so they want to evaluate on potential. Now, in my time period, they did have equal opportunity and various equal opportunity programs, but I think for the most part, that applied to blacks.
Questions?
Okay, while he's going up there, the other comment I would make is in the military service, like other companies, your performance is evaluated annually. So we would have what we call an efficiency report. In the commercial workplace, you might have some sort of evaluation process. So from my perspective, it was based on merit and the performance evaluation. For promotion to brigadier general and 2-star general, we would have centralized promotion boards. So, your immediate boss may not have that much of an influence because you're evaluated by a centralized board made up of representatives across the service. Yes?
Hi, General Chen. I really appreciate your insightful and influencing talk. I have a question about mentorship. Could you tell us one or two stories about one or two important mentor along your career path? Thank you.
Okay, this is mentorship. And is it mentoring of me? Is your question related to what I experienced in terms of mentoring me or whatever mentoring I did?
Probably both. How did you advance and how you managed to mentor the younger generations?
Okay, let me start with mentoring that I've received. Now, you have to sort of understand the Army at times, because when I was in the Army, I had the good fortune of working for a number of good bosses. Now, the bosses were very demanding, but what happens then? It's an opportunity for you to demonstrate your capabilities. I can remember when I was a lieutenant colonel, I was a staff officer in the Pentagon at the Department of Army Staff. So that means like I'm on a corporate staff and then there's the big boss. The big boss was smart, he was very demanding, and what would he do? He would give action officers like me a very complex, impossible task to complete within a very short time frame. But that was how, number one, he wanted to see your reactions, see what you could produce, see what sense you could make about this complex issue. And of course, if you've done well, that was his way of giving you compliments and giving you a good evaluation. I had another boss, a 3-star general at the time, and I was a 2-star general. And then the environment sometimes is such that, you know, the boss makes statements and they might even be a little bit harsh. And so he wants to see what your reaction is. And so part of it is you need to understand his behavior, his conduct, his idiosyncrasies, etc., on how best to respond. And I think he really appreciated it when you fought back or you made a convincing argument to do something else. Or you do something drastic. Okay, I was a project manager one time, and what does a project manager do? Well, he manages the prime contractor, and the prime contractor has a contract, and in this case it was production. So they had started up a second source production at a place called Camden, Arkansas. But what usually happens in initial startups? You have production problems, you have quality problems, and so as the project manager, I went to go visit that plant, and then I made my evaluation. And what did I do? I did something probably very few project managers would do, and I terminated production. And so that got people's attention, and so on the part of the contractor, of course, he knew he had lots of stuff to do, and then on the part of my boss, he actually would make statements in staff meetings that complimented me by saying, hey, look at this Chen. He stopped the production line because of quality problems. And of course, you know, you have to make the right decisions to do something like that. And hopefully if you've studied or if you've analyzed the situation, you'll come up with the right answer. Okay, in terms of mentoring, where I mentored others. After I retired from the Army, I had an assignment as the United States Vice President and General Manager of a joint venture company in Turkey. Now, it was a joint venture made up of my parent company in the U.S. with a parent company in Turkey, and then we had a plant in Ankara, Turkey. And so we had issues that dealt with engineering, development, and of course I had seen a lot of the problems before based upon my own previous experience. So what I would do is I would talk to the lead engineers involved, and I would effectively draw from him what he saw of the situation, and then I would convey to him what my actions would be, and I usually would phrase it into different alternatives as opposed to specifying a specific action. So you can go about mentoring different ways. If you give them the solution right away, you know, that, and they follow it, yes, they could fix the problem. But you want to try and get them to go through a process of their own decision making to see that if they can come to that same conclusion. Okay, next.
First, I would like to thank you to deliver such a rich and comprehensive talk. So the talk was wonderful. So I have two questions for you. The first question is about, I would like to know your comments about the glass ceiling, the glass ceiling dilemma. And the second is so you must have lots of food, heat, and lights. So I want to know what is your advice for the people in eager age group? So like for my daughter, she's a freshman in the college. So what is your advice for those students to be successful in their life? And then for the middle-aged people, like me, okay, I think I have the middle-age crisis. So what is your best advice for that? And then for my parents, because my parents actually, they were also born in the year of rabbit. So what is your best advice for the old generation? So I think you're so wise and so successful, I'd like to know that. But I have a question. The first question is the glass ceiling.
Okay.
One bill for dinner.
Okay, the glass ceiling, of course, is something that perhaps we will all experience, whether it's a glass ceiling for men, a glass ceiling for women, or whatever it is. So I think you need to look at the organization that you're in, the perhaps track record of that company or that organization in terms of their views, their culture. Have there been proper opportunities given to perhaps those that deserve to rise to the top? In many cases, you find that maybe it's impossible to penetrate, in which case the right answer might be look for work elsewhere. I can give you my own situation in the Army. In the Army, for promotion to 3-star and above, there is no promotion board. So the standard thinking in the Army is for the next grade up, like to 3-star and 4-star, it's the personal selection of the Chief of Staff of the Army. Now that may not necessarily be true because he has to get the concurrence of the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense, etc. So there, the situation is, how well are you known? Okay, in my own situation, I was more or less in a specialty area of weapon systems development. You know, research and development, managing weapon systems that get into production and get fielded. So that is not the mainstream of the Army. The mainstream of the Army are the war fighters, those that are in operations and plans, those that are commanders. And so naturally, when now you're talking about promotion to 3-star, you know, the opportunities are limited for somebody that was specialized like me. And so it happens in narrow windows of opportunity that's determined by the positions that are available. For those of us like me who effectively worked on weapons systems acquisition, there's only one position at the 3-star rank. And so when that position opens up, then there's a selection made. Now, I can say honestly that in that year where the 3-star was selected and I wasn't selected, that the Army made a good selection. Let me tell you the differences, okay? He and I were colonels together in the Pentagon. We were division chiefs, okay, so comparable. Then we became project managers. He became a project manager of a helicopter program. I became a project manager of an air defense missile system. Then we both got promoted to 1-star and 2-star. I commanded the U.S. Army Missile Command. He commanded the equivalent U.S. Army Aviation Command. Okay, but what were the discriminators, in my opinion? Number one, he was more well known because he also served in the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for operations and plan. Number two, he had a PhD. Number three, not only was he an Army aviator, he was one of the first Army astronauts. So, in my case, The Army made a good decision. Okay, let me try and answer the second question. Okay, we have different generations here, and I'm really pleased to see a lot of the younger generations here, because hopefully it's an opportunity where you can learn something outside of the classroom and outside of books and all that. And so, what I would say to the younger generation is you really need to try early on to develop interests and a passion for some area. Because, as I mentioned on the chart, that area, if you become an expert through education and then working on the outside, then you can be recognized and known. And so, if you have difficulty in finding what your interests are and passions, then I think within your schools you can look for different activities, extracurricular activities that might focus on a certain area. And it doesn't hurt to look at others and what kind of path the others took to reach the top or where they've been successful. Now, in terms of anybody in the midlife, probably being able to get to where you are, and in particular, having a daughter that's going to college, that in itself is a good mark. And so maybe it's time for you to relax more. And only do what you want to do instead of having other people tell you what to do. Now, for the older generation, well, you should be thankful if you're here that you have, your sons or daughters to help take care of you, support you. But at the same time, I think you need to keep your minds sharp. That means getting into activities that perhaps cause you to be able to mentally use your capabilities. I think my wife would say you always should have a salad lunch, so you have a healthy lunch. And take care of your health, because your health is most important.
Thank you.
Jonathan, thanks for the presentation. I want to ask a question regarding history. About history.
History.
Yeah, history is fluid and it takes unexpected turns. And I think we are probably witnessing that in the last few years. And so under the bigger predicament, where the Chinese-American relationship could be in a slippery slope, and how would you comment on that, and how, as ordinary Chinese Americans, how can we address that?
Well, I'm not a politician, so I can't really say much about what's going to happen in this trade war. All I can say is we can go back to World War II and the history of World War II, where the Chinese people and the American people cooperated and worked together against a common enemy. Now, General Chenault wrote a book called Way of the Fighter, written, copyrighted in 1949. The very last ending of his book, and I'll have to paraphrase it, is something like this. Let the symbol of the flying tiger remain aloft demonstration of two peoples on both shores of the Pacific, where there has been cooperation in working together. And so I think the key to this resolution of U.S. versus China is the need for cooperation, which means a better common understanding of the needs of each peoples, of each countries, and areas where there can be a balance, areas where, you know, there's bound to be competition, but areas where, in spite of the competition, there can be cooperation.
I want to make a comment, not so much a question, and then 2 points to comment. First, you know, Bill, I know you for many years, but your talk is just overwhelming. I am not sure to admit it properly to keep this, because even though we're in different professions and follow different career paths, so much you said resonates with my own experience. And we both lived American dream. So that's not good. Second is both directed towards younger Chinese Americans in this audience. You should really listen to this talk over and over again. Lots of things, even though you understood everything the first time, it won't mean nothing to you when you listen to it second time, third time. What is this? Make you think? Yes. Yeah. So you have plenty of time. Over and over and over again. That's all.
Thank you, Larry.
Yes, so we do have actually, Max Media is here taping, and Cal is taping it too, so we'll make the video available. I'll come back right to you. I've got to go to Ashley first.
Thank you so much, Bill, for a wonderful talk. This is another follow-up question on history, and now to do with the historical figure we were both talking about right before your talk, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And as you know, she was the liaison between Chanel and the Generalissimo during World War II. And she also, as you know, in 1943, had this tour from February to April. And it was such a wonderful tour, it was influential. And it did speak of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to, as you already mentioned, December 17, 1943. That was when it was repealed, signed into law by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And you had also mentioned meeting her in the 1950s. So I was just wondering, as someone who has been involved with the Flying Tigers, you have this family connection, and also family connection with war and all the work and service that your family has contributed to the United States. What was your impression like when you met her? How did you feel? And it was a major historical figure that you were meeting.
Okay, thank you for the question. First, it kind of goes back to my father. I mentioned that he was a pilot, and this was during the Sino-Japanese War. And he tells me an occasion where he flew Madame Chiang Kai-shek and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and there was a Japanese aircraft that attacked while they were in flight. And so what he had to do was he had to bring the airplane and dive down to the ground and then come back up to evade the Japanese aircraft. So, in terms of meeting Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and I was there in New York City when she addressed when she made her rounds in Washington, D.C., and I remember she gave an address to the Congress at that time, so I was a young kid at that time. But my father is a graduate of the University of Michigan. He was working for the airline called CAT, Civil Air Transport, headquartered in Taipei. And the University of Michigan would have numerous visits of professors and department heads, etc., and he would host them. He also was the president of the Alumni Association there. And so based upon those visits, the visiting department heads and professors, to include the president of the university, thought it would be a good idea to award an honorary degree to Madam Chiang Kai-shek. So that was approved, and the actual award was made in, I think, June of 1958. So my parents happened to be there in Ann Arbor for the ceremony. It was there that I met her. There was a reception hosted by the university, and they invited Chinese students from Ann Arbor to attend the reception. So that's where I met Madam Chiang Kai-shek. Now, they also asked me to give a speech there, believe it or not. And so this is 1958. I was probably 18 years old at that time. So I gave a speech and presented her with a souvenir plaque. And of course, Madam Chiang Kai-shek's English surpasses everybody in this room. And so that was impressive. And of course, she is impressive in her deliveries of speeches. And it was fortunate there that she was in the United States because General Chenault was in ill health. And shortly afterwards, he passed away. And so the memorial service and funeral was at Arlington Cemetery, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek was there, you know, at the cemetery. So, you know, she, no doubt, is one of the most renowned females in the world in terms of what she has done in promoting U.S.-China relationships. And she is, of course, well known for dealing with the United States and the relationships between the United States and China. Pardon me? Oh yes, all you have to do is look at the pictures.
So before I pass the mic, so all my fellow board members from Historic Society, right, we have a history question. You guys have to ask one.
Mr. Chen, well, thank you so much for your speech and for your service to our country. My father served in World War II. He was the son of a Chinese laundryman. He took all four of those children, his siblings. They all went to Columbia, got graduate degrees. He took his PhD and he served in the OSS in its early days in China. And so my family has a history similar to those here as descendants who are beneficiaries of this incredible kind of history. My question has to do with the phrase model minority. You would think from the stories told here and of my father that we are the model minority and that this is a good thing. But there seem to be pluses and minuses about that phrase. Like any label, it kind of sets up an expectation. I was just so curious about your attitude towards the phrase model minority.
Okay, I think the model minority, at least the characterization that I'm familiar with, are all these students that get entered into the premium colleges. Now, because people make statements, oh, they're the model minority, they get all these high SAT scores, etc. What I would say is, yes, a fraction of the Chinese American population and students going to college could be characterized as the model minority. But by and large, the bulk of Chinese American young people are like many other Americans. They don't necessarily go to the premium Ivy League colleges. And And so maybe it's a bad characterization. You also have perhaps a lot of the recent immigrants where the social economic conditions are not quite the same. So, are they the model minority? I don't know. I want to get back to your point. I don't know, did your father serve in China or Burma? China. Okay. Let me tell you a story of a couple of people that were in that World War II time period. In the 6th and 7th grades, I was in Washington, D.C. Back then, the only Chinese dim sum restaurant was called the Nanking Restaurant on New York Avenue, on 9th and New York Avenue. So my mother would take us there because we liked dim sum. Here's this gentleman that is always dressed in a dark suit as the maitre d' takes us to our table and so forth. And so many years later, I was the first lieutenant, and I went to a course on missiles, and it so happened that here in this classroom was a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, and that colonel was this maitre d' of the Nanking Restaurant. And his day job was in the CIA. And his name was Chen, who was in Burma. And these are stories that somehow we need to capture and tell because they become the forgotten soldiers. So anyways, he was, in fact, a graduate of Stanford Law School. As part of being in the Army, he went to Japanese language training. And so when he went to Burma, he was a Japanese linguist and interrogator. And he was in military intelligence working for General Stilwell. So, was he a member of the model minority? I don't know. I think he was just like many of us who were proud to serve and then made his accomplishments. And by the way, there is a video that is over 22 years old that is called We Served with Pride. It was produced by a young guy at that time. He was in his 20s. His name is Monty Palm, and he's putting out a new version of We Served with Pride, and in it, it features that Colonel Wanlo Chen. Can you speak louder, please?
Sorry, I have a question about education. I, as a international student, want to know, if you have some advice for us to, entering a new culture and how to adapt to the cultural exchange for us.
Okay, I think I have to get closer. My hearing has gotten worse at my old age.
So, do you have some advice for us, as international students, to adapt, how to adapt to a new culture, or adapt to cultural exchange?
Can you translate?
Yeah, I think as she mentioned, she's an international student here, and then as such, what would be your advice be for her and other people to adapt to the culture here, and in terms of this culture sharing exchange programs, things like that?
Okay, I think in terms of adapting, there are different theories, right? I mentioned earlier multiculturalism, diversity, etc., which, in my opinion, could cause retention of the individual separations, whereas I believe in assimilation. And this goes back to my comment about wherever you work, or even in a school environment, you should understand and get to know the customs, the traditions, and the culture of that environment, and be a part of it. And I would call that more of a stimulation as opposed to being separate.
Okay, so, all right. Make it a big one.
Thank you. Yeah, really big one. It's for, I got 14 years old son. I'm personally, I'm interested if someday he can serve for the country. But do you have any suggestion? But it's very hard to get into Annapolis and West Point. What kind of thing you think we should do for them?
Okay, I think in terms of the military academies, you don't necessarily have to have as high SATs as other universities, but what they like to look for is a more well-rounded person, somebody that perhaps excels in some sport, involved in activities, and of course, some measure of leadership. I would certainly say that going to a military academy is really an excellent, outstanding education because it tries to produce an all-around person, and it's a 100% scholarship. Of course, there's an obligation afterwards. Now, the other aspect is appointees come from members of Congress. So hopefully there's an opportunity to get to know your member of Congress. Now, each member of Congress probably follows their own process in the selection of candidates for the military academies. So you should try and understand what their process is, see what they're looking for, their criteria. And in terms of getting ready, I can't overemphasize aspects of leadership and some demonstration of, physical capabilities as in sports.
Other questions?
Thank you. So the question is, what are the beliefs and the values that you hold on that come with you come along with you to have you make such achievement and growth? And in terms of those values and systems, I'm pleased to see so many generations, young generations here. What beliefs and values you want to pass to them? Thank you.
Okay, so your question had to do with what kind of degrees or my education relative to progression? Beliefs. Beliefs and values.
So your value system, your core values.
Well, I think there are many basic core values. You have to have integrity. You have to have certain habits. You have to be willing to work hard. I would say no matter how brilliant you might be, there's still the need to work hard. And if you're not working to your potential, then shame on you. Because there are many others that may not have your abilities or your intellect, and yet, based upon their hard work, their drive, their enthusiasm, that they get ahead. So, I'll give you an example of an experience I went through when I was a 2-star general. And at that time, I was what they call a program executive officer for missile defense. So I was in charge of all the Army's missile defense programs. In particular, there was one segment of that that was called the lower tier air defense that involved the Patriot system and then a new system where the contractor was Loral Defense in Texas. And all of you know that Raytheon is here in Massachusetts. And so at one point in time, we had sufficient funding to support 2 separate engineering development programs of these systems that were from Raytheon and Loral Defense. However, there was a point in time when the funding was cut to only 1. And so, what happens? I was the architect then to design and develop the down select process among these 2 candidates. Now, the candidates had different technologies. For example, Raytheon was based upon the Patriot, and in those days, the end game was by a fusing system. So you have an onboard fuse to detect the incoming target, and then you have a blast fragmentation warhead, and hopefully the target flies into it. The other technology from Loral Defense was kinetic energy, or hit to kill. And you probably heard of the term bullet to bullet. So you have a bullet engage a bullet. And those were different technologies. But there were also similarities between the 2 in the sense that one came from the great state of Massachusetts, the other from Texas. So you had the congressional delegations involved. In those days, it was Senator Kennedy on one side and Representative Charlie Wilson. Anybody hear of Charlie Wilson? Right, Charlie Wilson was from Texas. He was instrumental in getting Stinger missiles in Afghanistan. So we have 2 congressional delegations all wanting their contractor to be selected. So, I was the architect for the down select process, and what I established was the criteria should be 1 on engineering data. In other words, we do a paper analysis of whatever their proposal is and whatever the contractors think they will do. The second, flight test results. And the third criteria was hardware in the loop simulation. You know, we will never have enough money to fund for a full flight test program. But if you have hardware in the loop simulation, you have all sorts of scenarios for incoming missiles, different altitudes, approaches, different jamming environments. If you can get an evaluation based upon hardware in the loop simulations, then that saves money and gives you more results that you can base a decision on. So I stuck with that criteria. Meanwhile, I said that there needs to be a missile evaluation board made up of all the Army's missile experts. They would give recommendations to an advisory council, which would be more a composition of users, people that have a stake in the program, and higher level management, etc., and then get a decision out of that. So what happens? Well, it takes time to conduct flight tests. Meanwhile, we get visits. There are visits by the contractors to high-level Army officials. And what did I experience? I got 2 calls directly from the Secretary of the Army saying, what can you do to make a decision earlier? And of course, those phone calls came immediately after some high-level executive from one of the contractors would visit the Secretary of the Army. And I had to say no to the Secretary of the Army twice. So, I wanted to protect the integrity of the process. We will make a decision based upon the criteria that I'll outline. So, I was able to persist. We made the selection, and the solution we selected was this hit-to-kill version. L'Oreal Defense was later acquired by Lockheed Martin, and so that system is currently was in production, fielded, and has had good results. Now, does that affect my promotion? Who knows? Now, the interesting thing, however, is, and this is a part of a question of how do you progress in your organization? Okay, I'll give you an example. If you visualize somebody, let's say a staff officer in the Pentagon as a lieutenant colonel, and later he gets promoted, he's a colonel, later he gets promoted to general, what happens? Well, if you're the action officer for a issue, then you're supposed to shepherd the workings of, the decision-making, et cetera, that you want the higher level bosses to make. So, you start out as an action officer, and when you sit in that conference room, the generals are at the front table, and you're lucky to be sitting in the background there because you're the lowest ranking person, maybe. Maybe if you're a colonel, you get to sit closer up, but it's that lieutenant colonel that really understands the issues. He preps the colonel, and more importantly, preps the generals so that they can speak sitting at the head of the table. So I had the experience. I had one assignment where I was one of these staff officers, and I became a colonel, then I sat closer to the table, and then I became a general, and I sat at the table. So that's part of learning. One of my bullets was, you learn by looking at your peers, your subordinates, and your bosses.
Can I ask you a quick, this isn't a question, this is just a comment. You've talked about assimilation, which I think is a very strong point. And there are two people I know in this audience that have assimilated. Well, he works with us in the Historical Society, Larry Ho, and Sophia, she's gone. They are terrific potential mentors to help understand how assimilation works. And one other fellow I don't see is Peter Lee, but he's another really young guy that's done a terrific job in town. And one of the reasons I wanted to speak was because I have to leave now. And I didn't want to be embarrassed. But I do think there are these are the two I know, but I'm sure there are many of you that have really assimilated, and these are two terrific mentors. Raise your hand, Bob. And I know because I've lived in Lexington 82 years, and I'm close to assimilating.
I can tell you a story about my father. We were at dinner at somebody's house, and then the people were talking about, hey, in senior age, wouldn't you like to go to a senior care center where it's all Chinese and you can get Chinese food and all that? And my father did not want that because he wanted to be assimilated. Okay.
So I'll take one last question.
Thank you, Major General. Your lecture has been the most...
I hope it wasn't a lecture.
I mean, it's the most impressive and moving speech that I have heard in my life. And I, as an international student as well, I would like to ask a question based on culture. So being a Chinese, we feel different. the feel that I towards the word Chinese American. I think during the speech that I have feel from the speech, it's really different between us. And I would like to ask a question about how you think about the Chinese and Chinese American, or how do you think of the balance between the Chinese and American? Because in the previous speech, you mentioned you want us, the Chinese American, to be called as the prominent Chinese. American, sorry. So, what's the balance, do you think?
Okay, I think with regards to, say, Chinese in America, or those that are American citizens, are staying on and whatnot, or growing up here in the United States, that, everybody comes from a different culture. We have no control over that. But what you need to do is try and decide what you want. If you grew up in a Chinese household and it was more traditional, is that what you want? And with that, do you want to go back to China? Because if the answer is yes, then that's what you do. On the other hand, if you think that there's a possibility that you see the United States, you see America as a country that you want to work in, live in, and be a part of, then you need to somewhat have a little transformation. Going back to my statement, you need to start blending in more. Now, somebody that I gave a speech one time to a group when I was in Minnesota, and she told me, this was a younger gal, that her parents would make a lunch for her to go to school, carried in these dishes with a handle and all that. And good noodles, good wonton, fried rice. And, hey, I would like that too. But what I would say is, if you're that kid going to school, that you should start this process of blending in, eat lunch with the others in the cafeteria, or if you're bringing your own lunch, bring a sandwich, but don't necessarily carry that nice wonton and fried rice. Now that might be a little drastic, but there are others that can adapt very well having that good lunch.
Thank you. So at this moment, I think we're going to be presenting General Chen a couple of small token of appreciations, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Here, so this is the flyer of today's talk.
Both Cal and Carey Memorial Library and Historical Society logos are here.
And then I think in terms about, so
you came from the Transcontinental Golden Spike, and then the United Post, office just issued some Americans. And then I think the next two gifts, I'll ask Wei Ying, she's the co-chair of Cal, to present it to you. A special thing,
So here we have the bag of the cow. But this bag actually has a very special meaning. So the bag was donated by the past lady, Chen. So who passed died accidentally, which is really a huge tragedy. And she donated this bag to the cow. So
very good.
Present this cow.
thanks everybody for coming. So with that, we wrap up the presentation. And General Chen actually will be back in September, and he's going to give a talk to the Lexington Veterans Association. And if we're lucky enough, we can invite him back for another talk on leadership, which is he already gave a preview of. Thank you. Oh, I think that also today, tomorrow is Happy Father's Day, right? Father's Day. So happy Father's Day.